Hello, welcome students. This is Mr. Kitts, and today we're going to be going over the Cold War. So this is the first lesson or lecture about the Cold War, and we're going to be covering kind of the basics, the intro, and just kind of getting into how this whole thing begins. So first off, why is it called the Cold War? What makes it cold? Is it because it was fought in Russia? Is it because it was cold when they were fighting the war? What makes this the Cold War? Well, it's not actually any of those things. It doesn't have to do with the temperature. It has to do with the fact that this war really is going to be game changing. It's going to be a world changing type of war. And it's not the type of war that we're thinking, like World War II. So we're coming off of World War II where there's this massive fighting. You have big names, big people like Hitler and Stalin and Franklin Roosevelt and Churchill, and some of these guys are still around. Obviously Hitler's not, Mussolini's not, they're long gone. But Stalin is still around. And now the US is run by a guy named Harry Truman, who's also going to be around too. And the problem is going to be, while they were friends during the war, so the US and Russia are going to fight on the same team during the war. When the war ends, that common enemy is gone. See, everybody agreed that Hitler was the most evil guy, right? The US, England, France, Russia, everybody agrees. Hitler is the most evil guy. We have to do whatever it takes to stop him. However, when the war is over and they start looking around and they start realizing, what do we do now? The US is this prosperous, they have a ton of money, they're capitalists, they believe in democracy. And then you have the Soviet Union, which is also extremely strong, large, but they're communist and they're a dictatorship. They don't see eye to eye with the United States, and this is where the problems are going to begin. So, who won World War II? And what are the superpowers that are coming out of this war? Well, first off, who won? So we know that the US and Russia are part of the quote winning team. They're a part of the winners here. And because they're a part of the winners always, like I've said in history, the winners always kind of get to determine what happens, right? Well, they are now the two most powerful entities or two most powerful countries on the planet. They're superpowers. And we're not talking about like superpowers like, being able to fly or things like that. We're talking, these are the two dominant countries in the world. And if you look at the world today, is the US still a superpower? The answer is yes, right? We have a massive economy, even though right now it's obviously not doing great. We still have a massive economy. We've got nuclear weapons. We've got the strongest army in the world. We are a superpower. And there are other superpowers throughout the world today. If you look, Russia still remains a superpower today. England, France, you might throw like Germany in there. China is a superpower. So there are still superpowers today. But during the Cold War, there are two major superpowers, and that's the US and Russia. And let's look at what's going to happen here. Now, this is the Americans and the Russians meeting at a place called Albi. Okay, so this is at the end of World War II. Look at the scene here. These are our soldiers coming together. They're shaking hands. There's pictures of these guys hugging. They've just fought a massive war. Now, the excitement is going to end and the happiness are going to fade very, very fast. All right, so let's look at some of the results of World War II. Now, World War II ends. The US and the Soviet Union are the superpowers. We're going to get rid of colonialization. So rewind back. Go back to December when we learned about imperialism, right? We talked about European nations colonizing places like Asia and Africa and India. All of those colonies, all of that stuff is going to go away. So this is when, like we talked about Gandhi gaining independence for India, this is around that time period, okay? Because they gained their independence in 1949, which is right after, if you look, right after World War II. I'm sorry, 47. Okay, and that's 40, and World War II ends in 45. So you can see this is where the decolonization is coming in. Now, when everybody gets into Germany, because obviously Hitler's the target in Europe here. So the US, Britain, and France are on one side, and the Soviets are controlling the eastern side of Germany. So the Americans are on the western side, and the Russians are on the eastern side. Now, the nice thing, I guess not nice thing, but the one easy thing for this is to know that America will always be the West. So whenever we talk about the West, like West Germany or West Berlin or Western Europe, we're talking about the American side or the American influence parts. If we talk about the East, East Germany, East Berlin, Eastern Europe, the Eastern satellite states, we're talking about stuff that is communist and is going to be controlled by the Soviet Union. Okay. Also, after World War II, China becomes communist. Now, if you remember back when we talked about China and its communist revolution, Mao and the Little Red Book and all that stuff, that's all going on now. Okay, so that's all happening post World War II. And it really does scare the US because now you have the largest country in the world by size is now communist, and the largest country in the world by population is now communist. This is going to scare some people. They're also going to create something called the United Nations. Now think back to World War I with the League of Nations, which was a massive, massive failure. The UN, on the other hand, is that still around today? The answer is yes. So the UN is going to have a little bit more success than the League of Nations. And Japan is going to be occupied by the US. So I know what you're thinking. We dropped 2 nukes on them. Why would we occupy them? Well, it's a very complicated situation that Japan and the US have. And in fact, if you look at Japan and the United States today, they are still close allies. Japan is a democracy. They're a capitalist. I think they have the 3rd or 4th largest economy in the world. And they are closely tied to the United States. In fact, Japan relies on the US to protect it in a lot of ways. When North Korea will test out its nukes or launch nukes or things of that nature, it is usually why the United States will get involved because of their close ties to Japan, which is right in that region, and their close ties to South Korea. Okay, so let's look at the peace conference. Now, before World War II ends, the big 3 are going to meet at a place called Yalta in Russia. And the big 3, as you can see on the picture here, are Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, and Joseph Stalin. Okay, and they go from left to right there. Okay, now they're going to decide a couple of things. One of the biggest things that they decide is that Germany is going to be divided into zones. Because at this point they kind of know that they're going to take Germany. Hitler is on the run. You know, the US is charging in from the west. The Russians are charging in from the east. They kind of have Hitler pinned in Germany. The end is near. They can see the handwriting here. So they're trying to figure out how the heck do we deal with this? So they decide the US will control Western Germany, and the Russians, the Soviets, will control Eastern Germany, and they'll all be divided into little zones. And you'll see that as we sort of get into the lesson, or into when we talk about what happens to Germany. Now, the U.S. is going to come up with sort of a unique idea. This is not really unique, but if you think about the U.S., they fought in World War I. They really didn't suffer any damage. They had a lot of money. They fought in World War II. Really, the only place that the U.S. gets hit is Pearl Harbor. And it's not to downplay Pearl Harbor. There was massive damage in Pearl Harbor. You have close to like 2,500 people die in Pearl Harbor. It's a travesty. But do they suffer the same damage that, say, London and Berlin and Paris and all of these major European cities suffer? Absolutely not. Most of the mainland war fighting is done in Europe. which means, I mean, you look at Stalingrad or Moscow, those cities are wiped. So what the US does is they take their money and they start these two things. There's two specific things they're going to start. One was called the Truman Doctrine. And this said that the US will help any country as long as they don't become communist. And they specifically are looking at two countries. One is Greece and one is Turkey. Because both of those countries were sort of giving into this idea that maybe communism was the right thing to do. Okay, we could get on board with this communism thing. Not so much. The US is going to swoop in and use their massive financial might or power, right? They're going to take their money and throw it around. Just like maybe a rich person comes in and sitting at a restaurant and says, well, I'll buy that and I'll buy that. I'll take the lobster. I'll take the steak. I'll take the best champagne, all that stuff. Okay. They go a little further because Greece and Turkey aren't the only countries that need help. So this was called the Marshall Plan. It's named after this guy right here. That's George Marshall, who you see in the slide there. And he was one of the generals in World War II. And basically, the U.S. is going to give $12 billion to war-torn Western Europe. Specifically, they're going to aim, you can see the payments here. I'm going to put a graph up. You can see the payments here. The United Kingdom, which is England, and France are really the people getting the most money because they need it. As I just mentioned, their countries are torn apart. Most of the war is fought during in those countries. You look at the Blitz of London, you look at what happens to France. I mean, most of mainland France is destroyed at this point. They need money to rebuild. You think about like states like Florida, right, or Puerto Rico last year when it got hit by that massive hurricane. When those states suffer these massive destruction, they need money to rebuild, right? Those cities need money to rebuild everything and sort of survive. Okay, so you can see they're funneling their money towards places like England, France, Italy, West Germany, not East Germany, because remember, East Germany is going to be communist. Okay, the Netherlands, Greece, other places like that. All right. So this is how the war is going to start. The U.S. is going to use its financial might, and Russia is going to go a different route because Russia can use its dictatorship, right? It can use the fact that they have power. They don't have to ask nicely. They can just say, do it or we kill you, right? So that's how the Soviets are going to go about this, while the U.S., like I said, is going to offer its money. Okay, so there's a couple of video clips that I'm going to put up with this. You should watch those video clips because they kind of coincide with this stuff. And then there will be a little worksheet for this as well. There's going to be some like a Google slide sheet that you'll do with this as well. All right, so that's the conclusion of the beginning of the Cold War. Sorry, I'm still in World War II mode. That's the beginning of the Cold War. With your next lesson, we're going to get into what's called the Iron Curtain, what happens to Germany, and what's going to go on specifically in the city of Berlin. All right. If you have any questions or anything, please email me. Otherwise, go on to the next lesson.